Hi everyone and welcome back to Chess for Charity. In this video, we're going to try to see if we can prove whether or not white can castle in this position. So, essentially what we need to see is if we can prove that whether or not the king or the rook has already moved. That's essentially what we're trying to prove, because if we can prove that, it means that white cannot castle. So we need to prove either way to see whether or not they have moved or not. Okay, so let's take stock of the position here. White has 4 pawns on this side, 4 pawns on this side. So all 8 pawns, both knights, both bishops, 1 rook, and then the king queen. Okay, so white's missing 1 rook. That's the conclusion there. And we see that there's a capture here. We'll keep that in mind. We see that this pawn captured here. We'll keep that in mind. On the black side, black has all their pawns. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Both their knights and 1 bishop, in particular their light squared bishop. Their dark squared bishop could not have escaped. So interesting to see that it's gone. And then they're missing both their rooks. Okay. Let's see what we can draw from that, all that information. So let's first point out that white's rook on a1, first it was blocked in by the pawns, and we see that there's a pawn capture on b4. So the pawn on a3 must have captured something on b4. Well, what did it capture here? Let's see if we can figure that out. Well, it couldn't have been the bishop, right? Because the bishop can't get out. These pawns are not going anywhere. And it seems like there are no other options except one of these rooks. So with that in mind, it means that this pawn on a3 captured a rook here on b4, a black rook. Okay, so how does the black rook get out? Because there are 2 rooks here. How did they get out? Well, we see that this pawn captured something, and that's the only way it could get out, right? If it was here, then the rook would not be able to leave. So that means that this black capture had to happen first, right? Let's make sure that makes sense. Black could not have gotten a piece to b4, in particular one of these rooks, if this pawn was on h6. Okay, so let's think about that again. So black captured on g5 first, and then later on maybe got the rook out, however they want to do it, and then they can take, right? I'm not showing that exactly, but just the idea. So black captured first. Well, what did black capture? Well, we mentioned that white is only missing a rook. Well, how does that make sense then? It couldn't have been this rook. And why not? Well, remember, the pawn on a2 wouldn't have been able to capture anything on b4 because the capture on b4 was this rook. Remember, we said that black had to capture first. Black had to capture first. So what does that mean exactly? Well, it means that the rook that was on g5 was actually the king rook. It was this rook because this pawn was blocked in. So perhaps it went something like this, up and over, and then they capture, and then that leads this rook to coming out, and that leads this rook to getting captured. So what does all that mean? Well, let's look at it one more time just to make sure it all makes sense, and we'll kind of review. So the bishop can't be captured by a pawn because the bishop cannot get out. Therefore, it's one of these rooks. Well, we also know that the only thing missing for white is a rook. So we say, okay, this pawn on a3 captured a rook on b4. And this pawn on g5 captured a rook on g5 from h6. Well, this rook on a1 could not have gotten out to get to g5 because this pawn would have had nothing to capture yet. Therefore, and this is kind of the beautiful logic piece, it must have been the h1 rook, the original king rook, to go up and over and kind of be the first thing to get captured, which then led to their rook coming out, the black rook coming out. Once that happens, then they can get me something on b4, and I can get out then. And it seems like from there, actually, this rook goes around and maybe something like that and goes to h1. So, with all that said, this rook on h1 is not the original king rook. Therefore, it's moved, and with that, white cannot castle in this position. Super cool logic puzzle. It's tough to figure out once you kind of think about it. If you're used to these puzzles, maybe you got to see the answer before I told you. But it's so cool. I have a couple of these in the channel, and I just really recommend you look them over. Maybe challenge yourself with a few of them. They're not so easy, but they really stretch your brain, and that's one of the reasons why I love chess and why I love doing these videos. So yeah, that is it for this video. If you enjoyed the content, be sure to like on YouTube. Thanks so much. Bye.